Hello, Epic Influencer. Welcome to the module on the A's of Influence. In this module, we're going to cover the 12 A's of Influence, and we're going to cover some strategies and examples on how to apply the 12 A's. And then we're going to share with you some of the secrets of communication and how to bring it all home and apply it so you can tangibly apply the A's of Influence in your daily influence rituals. We've divided the A's of Influence into 4 categories of 3 of the A's of Influence each. That way you can remember them by category and how to apply them consistently when you're thinking about the A's of Influence. The first category of the A's of the Influence are the connection A's. The connection A's start with authenticity. Authenticity is the first A of influence that we start with because when a prospect or a customer or anyone that you are influencing or leading feels a level of authenticity, that you're being honest, vulnerable, open, and that you're telling the truth, they can feel it. Rationally, pre-rationally, intuitively. And when we're using the A of authenticity, it builds a high level of trust and integrity. One powerful and simple way to work on the A of authenticity is to share something personal about yourself. For example, today I was talking with one of our customers and I shared with him that I spent some time with my nephews and my niece. And he expressed some empathy and connection around his family, and I did the same. Now, I didn't need to share with him that information, yet it brought us closer together. It humanized my experience with him, and he realized that I wasn't just someone who was influencing him, that I was a genuine person. And I unveiled a little bit into my personal life in a way that maintained rapport and connection, in a way that he could genuinely have a peek into the world that is Jake beyond just a business person. When we're able to do this in the most simple and effective ways, it builds a high level of trust and integrity. Another powerful way to express the A of authenticity, especially when we're starting out in a new sales role or in a new environment or with a new customer, is to simply be able to answer a question about the product or service with, "I don't know the answer to that right now, let me get back to you." When we authentically are able to share the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth of what we know about them, the product, the marketplace, it is our level of transparency and truth that comes through in the conversation, so much so that they realize that you are not a BSer. There's plenty of salespeople out there who get the reputation of pulling the wool over the sheep's eyes. And the best influencers on the planet are high integrity and extremely authentic with who they are, and that cultivates a high level of fidelity and trust with the prospect. Another way to demonstrate authenticity is to hold the paradox of certainty and uncertainty simultaneously. Meaning, when you're having a conversation with a prospect or anyone that you're influencing or leading, if you come in with just absolute certainty that you know all of the answers, that you know everything, and making any assumptions that they don't, or that there's zero uncertainty on your part, it violates some type of intuitive trust. When we're able to hold the paradox of certainty, meaning we're really certain on the things that we're sure of, we know what we know, and we're also willing to express that we don't know what we don't know, and hold that paradox simultaneously, it's authentic, because the truth of the matter is, you know a lot of things about your product, about the service, about the marketplace, and the truth is there are some things that are unknown. And when a prospect feels that level of authenticity in you, it builds a lot of trust and integrity in your relationship. One way to demonstrate the paradox of certainty and uncertainty in an influence conversation is to simply share with a customer or a prospect that we might decide to work together and we might decide not to work together, and either way is fine. It simply sets the frame of we might hit this outcome or we might not hit this outcome. And there's a certain level of certainty in, hey, we might work together. And obviously that's the purpose of us having this conversation. There's also the openness to not working together. And that drives a certain level of trust and knowingness that you're simply there to find the truth, which is what authenticity is all about. An epic influencer is searching for the truth authentically to find out if there's a good product market fit, or in a leadership conversation, to find out if genuinely their perspective of the leader is going to serve the perspective of the mentee. Authenticity is part of the connection A's because it brings you more connection and bonding with the prospect. The more authentic we are, the more real we are, especially in an aligned way, the more people want to come towards us. In fact, we were once talking to a venture capitalist, and they asked the question, how do you know if someone's worth investing in? His answer was, I know that someone's worth investing in when they express to me who they are authentically. That's how I know to trust them. That's also how I know that they're able to lead a team to the promised land. The next connection A is appreciation. And here's a rule of thumb. What we appreciate, appreciates. When we appreciate someone, our connection increases and the trust and the bond increases. You see, every person has their own unique model of the world. They have their own belief systems. They have their own way of dealing with problems, of sorting out the world. An epic influencer appreciates the model of the world and the way of being of their prospects or the people that they're leading and influencing. And when we appreciate those people, they then feel understood. And when they feel understood, they feel seen. And when they feel seen, they're willing to share more information. And indirectly, that builds trust. One of the most powerful rules of thumb on appreciation is to be curious first and critical second. Or curious first and driving for the outcome second. If we show up to an influence conversation driving to our agenda before we truly understand and appreciate the model of the world and the agenda of the prospects, it's going to break connection. So what we want to do is to appreciate, through asking powerful, inquisitive questions, the needs, wants, desires of the prospect or person that we're influencing, so we can genuinely understand them first before we drive to any outcome. And one of the most powerful things that this ends up bringing up is any objections, any challenges, any lacks of understanding they may have, so we can effectively serve them. When we are appreciating someone, we're genuinely coming from a place of service. We're genuinely coming from a place of connecting with them to help them with what they want, with what they need, rather than simply driving our own agenda. And people can feel this. And ultimately, when you feel appreciated or when a prospect feels appreciated, it genuinely opens someone up. And when a prospect is open, I like to think about it as a little window of influence. When a prospect opens themselves just enough, or if someone that we're leading opens themselves just enough, we then have an opportunity to go in and share our truth, share our perspective after they've opened. If they haven't opened themselves to us, then there's probably a pretty good opportunity to appreciate that person more. One simple rule of thumb that we like to think about to ask a prospect in the very beginning of a conversation is, why are we here? From your perspective, why did you decide to have this conversation? What's important to you? And ideally, at the end of this conversation, what would you like to see us have accomplished? Setting that frame will help you understand how to effectively serve the prospect, the customer, the person you're leading in a way that meets their outcome, and then you can align your outcome, your agenda to theirs, and simultaneously drive their needs and your needs forward in a way that creates alignment, cohesion, and connection, and ultimately builds trust in the relationship. On top of asking really powerful, intelligent questions that are acutely designed to serve the prospect, another way that we can use the A of appreciation is to simply express our appreciation for something about that prospect. For example, if you're working an enterprise deal and you know that John Smith, enterprise buyer, has a lot on his plate and he's made the time to meet with you on top of all the different balls that he's juggling, it might be really nice to appreciate, John, I've noticed that you've got a lot going on in your docket, and I really appreciate how you're able to strategically manage A, B, and C so admirably in your business while also driving to solve problem XYZ that you and I are working towards. And I find that really admirable about you, and I really appreciate that we're able to have this conversation, your level of professionalism. I look forward to working with you more. Now, if done from a place of authenticity and truth, this can land with the prospect in a really powerful way. If done from a place of inauthenticity, which was the first A, it can feel like you're trying to brown nose them or earn brownie points, which doesn't work. So you'll begin to notice that these A's build on each other. As we can simultaneously use multiple A's in a conversation, it then builds more connection, more rapport, and understanding with the prospect. Which brings us to the point of intent. You see, our intent of the communication is extremely important. If our intent is to serve the prospect, to build trust, to collectively move towards a win-win outcome, then that's going to come through. However, it's really important to consider, and why these A's are so important, as the intent isn't always received by the prospect or the person we're leading. It's really important that we have positive intent. We come from a place of service. However, there are times, and we can tell this, that the intent of our communication sometimes isn't received. So it's important to be aware that the intent is just as important as the prospect's or the person you're influencing's capacity to receive the information. That's why the A's become so important and imperative, because when we can link these A's together, it helps the prospect, the person we're influencing, receive the information powerfully in a way that's tangible and understood by them. And when we're able to link a lot of these A's together, we begin to see patterns of the people that we're communicating with to be able to receive the information effortlessly. The third of the connection A's, but certainly not least, is the A of affinity. Affinity is the capacity to build a lot of connection. Some people refer to this as rapport. This is our capacity to match, mirror, and mimic the tone, timbre, pace, cadence, values, ethics, ways of being, interests, and ideas with the person we are influencing. We often ask our trainees in live trainings, what's the difference between mimicking a prospect and mocking them? Think about that for a minute. What's the difference between mimicking a prospect and mocking them? When we're mimicking a prospect, we're going into their modalities, their way of communicating, to genuinely appreciate the way that they are, to be similar to them. If you want to break rapport with anybody, simply be yourself. Being yourself is a perfect way to go out of rapport with somebody. What do I mean by that? Well, if someone talks really fast and you happen to talk really slow, for example, that is instantaneously going to break a little bit of rapport. However, if we can match the tone, timbre, pace, and cadence of the prospect's language, it'll bring us closer together. And when that's done with positive intent, we're mimicking. When that's done to mock them, make fun of them, as intent that isn't genuine, that doesn't have compassion for the prospect, it's felt is inauthentic, and it feels a lot like mocking somebody. So people genuinely appreciate if we go into rapport with them, even so slightly, as to adjust our own way of communicating to a way that they can receive the information that we're sharing with them. A great example of affinity is one of the epic influencers that we work with always stays up on the current events and watches ESPN SportsCenter. And the reason he does this, he always wants to be ahead of the curve and be knowledgeable on sports, because a lot of his call points, a lot of his customers care a lot about the sports. So he becomes very mindful of what are the different sports teams that my prospects like, and he stays attuned, and he can stay in affinity by having communication around their sports team and deeply caring about what they care about too. And the way that he communicates this matches their way of communicating about the sports team, i.e. if a customer likes Steph Curry and thinks Steph Curry is really good, he can understand what Steph Curry's stats are, appreciate that about him, and also poke fun at his own team, and there can be positive banter that ends up bringing connection together. And we all know this. We all know what affinity is. Everyone who's taught one-on-one sales thinks about rapport. Yet a lot of this common sense information isn't necessarily common practice. To be mastering the A's of influence, we want to be practicing this not just sometimes, but all of the time. One of my favorite ways to practice affinity is if we have an auditory digital, a really analytical person that we're working with. And those people talk a little bit differently. They have slower speech. They're really concise and thoughtful in the words that they choose. And when we go into patterns of being really concise and thoughtful about the words that we choose and slow down our language to be a little bit more inquisitive and curious, and we slow down and there's a little bit of uncertainty, but also there's an intelligence to it that has more rapport with the auditory digital type of prospect or person that you're working with. This can build rapport when done effectively, and what ends up being really interesting is once you've met them there, you can then move into your own authentic way of communicating and potentially use your own modality once there's a certain level of trust and bonding that's happened. Once the window is open enough, they're going to feel your authenticity and more trust will be built. It can be a little bit painful to stay in someone else's modality for longer than a few minutes. There's not a need to do that necessarily. We can connect with them first, help them open the window, and once the window's open, we can begin to be a little bit more ourselves, a little bit more authentic, and to genuinely make sure that we keep doing this from a place of positive intent. Remember, the intent is just as important as the information that's received. So for whatever reason that rapport happens to be broken, we're going to notice resistance in the prospect. If we're noticing any type of resistance in the prospect, it's simply an opportunity to pause, take a break, reevaluate, and ask yourself the question, where do I not have affinity? Where is there an opportunity to have more affinity with this particular person and truly understand and appreciate their model of the world, their communication modalities, what they genuinely care about? Once we do that, the window's open again, and we can hop in that window and genuinely serve the person we're influencing. The next 3 A's of influence are the leadership A's. The leadership A's are so important because what the world needs now more than ever is leadership, is leaders who are able to go out there and claim their authentic capacity to lead, to serve. People are hungry for this because there's so much uncertainty out there. So the first A under the leadership A's is authentication. Authentication is where we demonstrate the social proof using stories, names, examples. This is where referrals come in. If someone refers you to another person, there's automatic authentication. This is where testimonials come in. This is automatic proof that who you are, your product, your service is authenticated by somebody else. You see, we're tribal beings, and unconsciously, we're always thinking to ourselves, does someone else trust this person? Does someone else trust this company? And when we show authentication, this demonstrates the unconscious mind of the prospect that other people tribally are in alignment with this product, this service, this person. You know, we all know somebody in our network who's like the classic name dropper. I just hung out with Tim Ferriss this weekend, and I was hanging out with Richard Branson in Necker Island. And these folks who do that always get this funny reputation as a name dropper, but at the same time, they're using the A of authentication powerfully. I know someone in our network who's always taking pictures with all the celebrities and all the CEOs and all the high-powered executives that he's bumping elbows with. He's got hundreds of pictures. And there's kind of this joke that he's a big name dropper and all these things, but at the same time, it's built an interesting amount of trust among our cohorts for this person. And if we're able to use authenticity in our authentication, when it's not just coming from this place of, hey, look at me, I know all these people, when it's coming from a place of, I have genuinely built trust with these other people. I've genuinely built trust with these other companies. And people can feel the level of authenticity in it. It builds that much more trust. Hence showing the power of linking multiple A's. Authentication is a leadership A because people will see you as being out there in the marketplace, making things happen, meeting new people, taking action, communicating your value, and building trust tribally throughout the network. And when we see that other people have built trust with others, we see those people inherently as leaders. We see them as being able to make things happen, the doers, the action takers. Those who are proactively making their mark in the world are the ones that are unconsciously seen as leaders, building trust, and ultimately the ones supporting the marketplace and making things happen. A simple example of authentication when working an enterprise deal, if you've got multiple stakeholders in on the account, is to simply share the stakeholders that have a high level of integrity inside of the organization that you've spoken with and that they've shared their approval with the opportunity to work with your company. It becomes really important to have a high level of integrity when we're using authentication, because oftentimes people are trying to disqualify. Is this person really authenticated? Did John Smith really approve of their SOW? When we genuinely come from a place of truth and integrity using authentication, it feels much more trustworthy. I highly recommend that if you're going to use authentication as a leadership A of influence, that you make sure that whatever you do say can be backed up by the person who you're using as an authentication pillar. The next leadership A of influence is the A of affiliation. Affiliation is the capacity to create a comparison to a thought leader or a brand or some type of organization, even a location that has a certain association to it. What do I mean by that? Well, we run our business out of San Francisco, and there's a certain affiliation that people have when they think about San Francisco. They think innovation, they think fast-growing businesses, they think success. There's a certain level of affiliation and trust that is communicated when somebody shares that their business is in San Francisco. Another great example of affiliation is to be able to communicate a relationship, whether it be a customer or simply a strategic partnership with a brand that has a lot of fidelity. We have a customer who has a really powerful relationship with Facebook, for example. And one of the things they communicate in their influence strategy is that key relationship and the affiliation they have with that brand. Because there's a lot of trust and there's a lot of knowledge of what Facebook is, and they are a key provider of that service. So they're able to present that powerfully and authentically during their influence conversations. They can even cite certain stakeholders inside of that organization, inside of that account, who have affiliated with them and are in strong relationship with them, and ultimately that builds trust with the people that we work with. Now, the difference between authentication and affiliation is that affiliation supposes that we are like them, we are similar to them, we have the same level of trust as them, we are able to deliver at the same level of integrity as them. Whereas authentication says, these people trust that we're going to deliver, so you might trust us too. It's a very subtle difference, yet a really important one for us to be able to practice them individually and even sometimes collectively. So the third A of leadership is authority. You see, once we've established authentication and affiliation, we automatically have a little bit more authority, don't we? And there are some key things that allow us to have more authority in an influence conversation. One of the ways to establish authority is with the way in which we communicate, and the way in which we position ourselves as the leader of the conversation. One of the most powerful ways to do that is to set a pre-frame which establishes the parameters for the context of the conversation. The one who sets the parameters of the conversation then automatically and unconsciously becomes the leader of the conversation. One of the ways to do this is simply set the pre-frame before every conversation. A pre-frame could look like, in this conversation, here are the things that we're going to cover, John. Is that okay? That simply shows that you are the one that's going to lead the conversation. There's many different ways to display authority. I was once having a conversation with one of her customers, and she was sharing with me how her business actually doubled when she changed her attire. She changed her wardrobe, and her wardrobe ended up having more authority, more professionalism. And it was a suggestion by one of her colleagues, and she was asking, hey, why don't I get these bigger scopes of work? And the colleague was like, well, have you thought about how you dress? What if you dressed with more authority, more command, more professionalism? And I kid you not, she shared with me that that actually had an effect of doubling her business, of her being perceived as an authority by the customer, and not necessarily as an equal or not necessarily as a subordinate, as someone who's more of an employee or a consultant, but someone who had command and the authority to be perceived as someone who was higher value than the person she was doing business with. One of the easiest, simplest, and most powerful ways to become an authority is to master the subject matter in which you are influencing on, to be a master of your product, to be a master of the knowledge base of the marketplace, to truly understand the problems, the solutions, the opportunities in the marketplace. When you show up as someone who is able to own the context and simultaneously be an expert on the content and have a slight edge and authority of knowledge and wisdom, this automatically creates an unconscious understanding that you are the authority in the conversation. The leadership A's are imperative because ultimately we need permission to lead. If we're just going into a conversation assuming that we're going to lead it, yet there's resistance in a prospect, a resistance is simply a sign of a lack of a willingness for the prospect to be led by us. And when we use the leadership A's powerfully and simply and authentically, this allows them to feel comfortable and confident for us to take the lead on the conversation. They then feel confident in our direction, where we're going, that we're going to help them get to the outcome that we've both agreed on. Again, the world is hungry for more leaders, more individuals who are willing to step up and master the skills and tools of their domain, to genuinely be experts in what they are presenting and influencing the marketplace on. It becomes your responsibility as an epic influencer to be an authority, to be a leader, to find the areas of authentication and affiliation that are aligned with what your prospect needs to understand and hear from you in a way that they can open their window and receive your leadership. The third category of the A's of influence are the polarity A's. The polarity A's are the ones that drive emotion, that get us into action. You see, when we're effectively using the polarity A's of influence, we're serving the prospect to be able to move forward in their decision-making process, to be able to have the emotional capacity to say yes, to have the emotional capacity to take the next call, to make the decision, to even make micro decisions along the way that are moving the process forward. If you've ever found yourself in an influence conversation where it kind of goes flat and they're saying yes, but they're not moving forward, and you can sense that they're intellectually a yes, but emotionally not, we need to then bring in the A's of influence that are the polarity A's to help them to drive action. The first polarity A is the A of abundance. This is one of our favorite A's that we like to discuss. Abundance is focusing on adding value first, to be abundant in your nature, to have the energy, the value, the wisdom, the guidance, the expertise, the capacity to genuinely show up in a place of service where it feels to your prospect that your level of service is overflowing, like you have a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of desire to serve them. Now, there's polarity to the A of abundance because abundance is also paradoxically the A that has scarcity lined into it. So what do I mean by that? How can we have scarcity and abundance simultaneously? Well, when someone's really abundant, they're in demand. They're a valuable person. So we can then assume when someone is really abundant, that abundance is only going to be delivered if it's received. And we can play with the polarity of this when discussing abundance with a prospect to be genuinely benevolent, to be genuinely giving, yet set parameters and guidelines and boundaries for what we're willing to accept, for how we're willing to have the prospect show up. To genuinely be abundant with conditions, with the condition of my time is really valuable, your time is really valuable, and I'm willing to give it everything it takes, so long as you're willing to give it everything it takes as well on your side of things. You see, we want to be around abundant people. When people are genuinely abundant and giving in their nature, it creates the reciprocity to want to give more to them. And paradoxically, when people set boundaries that my abundance has the conditions of us needing to show up in certain ways and be in integrity with each other, there's also the paradox of scarcity. There's the paradox of, well, this abundance is going to go away if I am genuinely not showing up as a prospect or someone who's in a leadership relationship with being in integrity with this person's values, their way of being, and the rules that they've set up to be able to maintain that level of abundant flow in the relationship. One great way to express abundance in a leadership context is to share something with someone you're in a mentorship relationship with. I'd be happy to talk with you anytime. In fact, my parameters for hopping on my calendar are to simply shoot me an email, let me know your objectives for having a conversation, let me know the potential outcome for the conversation, any challenges that you're going through, and any potential opportunities that you believe would solve the problems you're going through. So paradoxically, and in a polarity sense, you're being very abundant with your time, and you're setting strict parameters that if you want to have a conversation, that the conversation has certain guidelines, certain rules, certain ways of being for your benevolent and abundant nature to be received by them. You see, this invites them to be abundant with the way they show up to you. It becomes something that's reciprocal. It also has a certain level of scarcity driven into it, meaning I'm not going to give my time just to anybody. I'm more interested in talking to people who are really clear and proactive about solving their own problems. That way, when we have a conversation, we can have that conversation in a shorter period of time or a more focused conversation that will allow us to drive to the outcome in a simple manner. At the end of the day, abundance is really an essence. It's a way of being. It's a way of being so benevolent, so giving, so authentic that we have the type of energy, the type of wisdom, the type of knowledge that our cup floweth over. And people can feel that when they're working with someone. People can feel the abundant nature of an individual. So when we have genuinely filled our cup up first, when we've taken care of ourselves, when we've done the research, done the homework, fully prepared for the conversation, and we genuinely show up from this place of benevolence, compassion, and care, and willingness to serve, our abundant nature comes through, and there's something intrinsically that is reciprocated, and people genuinely want to show up more powerfully for those who have an abundant and benevolent nature. One of the core drivers of being an abundant nature is to be unattached to the outcome, to not need it to look a certain way. For example, someone who's influencing with a high level of abundance might say something to a customer around, hey, we're going to try to find out if this is a good fit for us to work together. And if for whatever reason it's not, a lot of times I might be able to refer you to a different vendor, someone who can provide the service that might be a better fit for you. And if it is a good fit for us to work together, I'll share that with you explicitly at the end of our conversation. A really abundant influencer is willing to tell a prospect, no, it's not a good fit, if it genuinely isn't. This creates good karma, good deeds, and good integrity in the marketplace. And oftentimes, that prospect, because they're really clear on what your product market fit is, they end up referring you to other people just because of how you showed up in your genuine, abundant nature. The next polarity A is adherence. Adherence is helping a prospect make small commitments to hold them accountable, and this allows everybody to build trust. You see, we want to be in integrity and in alignment with what we say we're going to do. So when we invite a prospect to make little commitments, to follow our lead just with little yeses, this creates a certain level of adherence. A simple question might be to a prospect that is ultimately what you want, right? To do ABC that you just shared with me, to repeat back to them what they said they want, that is ultimately what you want, right? It's a tie-down phrase that links a yes to adhering with what they said they were going to do. This is a polarity A because if all we're doing is tying them down and closing, this doesn't feel good to a prospect. So what we want to do to genuinely serve in our benevolent, abundant polarity nature is to make micro closes and then release. Make micro closes to help them say yes, and then give them the freedom to decide, to take their own path in the conversation, to talk about some other things, and they get another micro yes, another micro adherence during the conversation. Enough of these stringed together feels good to the prospect because they're ultimately agreeing to what they already know they need to be doing. You're simply holding them accountable in a way that feels good to them, in a way that feels like you're holding them down, yet also giving them the freedom of choice to be in alignment with their own decision-making process. So not only are we doing micro closes, we're also doing micro opens where we're opening them up and really testing, is that really what you want? Is that really what you're looking for? Which gives them the freedom of choice, gives them the freedom of free will, which we all want in a buying decision. Yet when you have the advantage of knowing what the product market fit is and holding them to be in integrity with little yeses along the way, it makes it much easier for them to make the final commitment and sign the paperwork because they are wanting to be unconsciously in integrity with the micro yeses they've said along the way. Another great example of adherence is at the end of a conversation with someone that we're leading or a prospect, when we, as the influencer, as the leader, make micro commitments. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put together the scope of work. We're going to talk on Friday at 3 o'clock, and I'm going to have ABC prepared for you. This is our capacity to be in adherence and in integrity with them, which genuinely creates reciprocity. And then we ask them to hold themselves to be accountable with what they say they're going to do. So you mentioned, John, you were going to talk to stakeholder A and stakeholder B about this, and can I hold you accountable to have those conversations by Friday at 3 o'clock? Is that fair? Little tie-down question at the end, locks in the yes, and allows them to then be in integrity with what they said they were going to do. This prevents that limbo thing that happens in a multi-step sales conversation where someone ends up in the middle of a pipeline and nothing gets followed through on because we haven't given them the gift of adhering to a simple set of steps that moves the conversation forward in a way that everyone is agreeing to. That's our responsibility on our end of things, and also their responsibility on their end of things. People want to be in a relationship with those who can follow through on their own adherence and also with those who are holding them in integrity and accountable for what they've committed to as well. Adherence creates this emotional drive to follow through, this pre-rational drive to move the ball forward, this emotional yes to continuing the process. We unconsciously are driven emotionally to stay in integrity with those that we have a relationship with, especially if there's parameters of that relationship and everybody is clear on what the next steps are. The final polarity A is the A of arousal, remembering that emotion is the thing that drives people to take action. If we haven't properly linked an emotional driver to moving the ball forward, oftentimes the deal falls flat. Epic influencers are able to show the pain and the pleasure if things don't change. In an influence conversation, when we've been able to dig down deep to the root, and we simply ask the person we're working with, what's the consequence, John, if things don't change? What's the consequence if things stay the way they are? what happens then? Now, this invites the prospect, the person we're communicating with, to then have to think about the pain of not changing. And if for whatever reason there isn't any pain there, then we probably haven't gotten to the root. So we want to link pain to the root challenge, to the ultimate problem, the thing that's ultimately in the way of them making a decision, and showing them and inviting them to link the emotion of not changing of pain. This can be done in a really civil, mindful, and thoughtful way. And this genuinely comes from a place of service. A lot of times, this is the thing that epic influencers try to shy away from because they don't want to see somebody experiencing pain in the moment. In fact, they sometimes are averse to that. However, if you genuinely care about your prospect and you know that you're there to serve them in a benevolent manner, then we're willing to show them the consequences of what it means to not change. We're helping them understand the severity of the problem because we are experts and because we've seen other people in similar situations. We're able to share with them exactly why something needs to change. Similarly, on the pleasure side of things, we want to deeply understand and appreciate the model of the world of the prospect, so much so that we know the dopamine and serotonin reward and the neurochemistry they're going to get if they solve the problem. If we're able to work towards this solution, John, what will that ultimately give you? How will this show up? And what will that allow you to do in your current situation? One of the best ways to stimulate arousal is by asking questions. And truthfully, we can also, if we have permission and the window is open, we can also share authentically the way we see it. John, is it okay if I share with you some perspective? What I see for you is if you're able to implement this, here's what a potential vision could be. Here's what the opportunity could be. Or we can also directly share with them, hey, if nothing changes, John, here's what I could see the potential consequences could be. Are you open to hearing that? And then they share yes or no. We get consent from them to bring them to a state of arousal. The interesting thing to know about human behavior is 70% of people are more pain motivated, meaning their neurological nervous system is more wired to move away from pain and avoid danger than it is to seek pleasure. About 30% of the marketplace, 30% of the population is linked to focus on chasing the pleasure, chasing the opportunity. These people are more, the cup is half full. These are the optimists of the world. These are the ones who get really excited about an opportunity. When we've taken the time to genuinely understand who is this prospect, are they more away from oriented? Is pain going to help them be aroused? Are they more pleasure oriented? Is showing them a future that is better than their current situation going to serve them more? We genuinely are able to work with their modalities of how they operate. Now, here's the secret. Everybody is both. Everybody is both pain and pleasure oriented. Yet it's important to know which way someone leans. If someone leans a little bit more pain oriented, we want to make sure that we go there. In fact, the most powerful epic influencers are always able to arouse the emotional triggers of the prospect by asking the right questions that hit a little bit of a nerve. Now, we want to make sure we do this with a genuine level of rapport, compassion, and positive intent to serve the person we're influencing. We know that we've done an effective job with the polarity A's of influence when we can notice the energy of a prospect rising, when they have a little bit more passion in their communication, when they're enthusiastic about moving forward with the relationship. If the energy is low and there's confusion or there's not a whole lot of passion behind moving forward, we then simply have to link back to the pain, pleasure, to help them be in adherence with what they said before, and to remember our abundant nature and potentially interrupt their pattern, their way of being, because we're willing to care so deeply about their needs, wants, and desires, and we're able to help them raise their energy to a level where their emotion can drive them forward, to make a better decision. You see, oftentimes mentally we've made a decision, yet we don't have the energy to drive forward to take action on that. Those epic influencers who can see that a customer is a yes in their head, but emotionally they need to catch up to it, are willing to raise the emotional energy of the prospect to genuinely serve them to move the conversation forward. The last group of the A's of influence are the imagination A's. The imagination A's are so powerful because they put our prospects into an imagination frame where they begin to imagine what it would be like for us to continue the relationship, work together, and ultimately it gives them a compelling future to move forward in working with us. The first imagination A is allegory. Allegory is used when we share stories and metaphors. This creates a massive amount of engagement, curiosity, and excitement. You see, we grew up as human beings telling stories around the campfire. You might even remember a time when you were a kid around a campfire, around some type of social setting where someone was a really good storyteller, where someone almost shared a story as if you became the main character in it. This is what's really powerful about movies, about theater, about stories and books that put us into the mindset of the main character who's on a hero's journey, who's taking the journey that we might want to take one day. And as an epic influencer, when you can share allegories with a prospect, it helps their critical filter, their conscious mind, quiet down a little bit. It turns on the unconscious mind. Someone who's a really great storyteller even finds themselves communicating with people, and the ones they're communicating with tend to go into a little bit of a trance when we're sharing stories. Because when a story starts to happen, we begin to imagine ourselves in the role of the hero, in the role of the person that the story is about. It's an unconscious thing. It happens on cue. And when we truly care about the well-being of a prospect or a person we're influencing, we're willing to share stories with them that relate to their way of being. A simple way that we like to share allegories with the people that we work with is that becoming an epic influencer is a little bit like Jedi training school. It's first and foremost attractive to those who have the aptitude, the intelligence, the interpersonal skills, the emotional, social intelligence to become an epic influencer. And it's also attractive to those who have that Jedi level of commitment, of mastery, the ones who have the hunger, the passion, the drive to do the spaced repetition and practice over and over again the simple things that make somebody great. It's a little like this. Justin Janowski, who's one of our top salespeople, has practiced the pre-frame of his epic influence structure over and over and over again so many times that he has it down pat. We actually use him as an allegory of training because he's such a great metaphor for someone who embodies the Jedi skills of what it means to be an epic influencer. It becomes really important to know the audience, to know the person's hero's journey they want to be in, to be genuinely curious, what's the story, what's the metaphor that's going to allow this person that we're communicating with to go into another world, to imagination land, if you will, so they can see themselves beyond their current position at a level where they are operating more effectively with a more compelling vision for their future. So ultimately, what allegory does is it shows a future that's better than the present moment through sharing a story or a metaphor that is relatable to the person that we're communicating with. The next A of imagination is augmentation. Augmented reality. It's a really big thing now in the tech world to be able to see an alternate reality for oneself. This allows us to be able to share with someone that we're working with what their compelling future might look like so they can begin to see themselves in the new world. A language frame to serve someone that we're working with would be an imagination frame. Imagine, John, what it would look like for you to be implementing ABC product. How would your team react to it? What would be better for you? We begin to ask leading questions that opens up a frame in their mind of a future that they can see that is better than their current reality. When working with someone directly, it's really interesting to become curious about how would they walk, how would they talk, how would they communicate, how would life be better for them, how would we imagine them to be, having applied the product or service, and then begin to ask them leading questions or even show them through an allegory or a story and augment the reality of what their future is going to look like, implementing and integrating the product or service that we have for them. It's our responsibility as epic influencers to be able to see a vision for a prospect that's more compelling than their current one and be able to invite them into seeing that themselves. When we do that, our prospects end up getting pulled by the vision as opposed to having to be motivated simply by pain and pleasure to get there. When we're augmenting the reality, people become pulled by an opportunity that is exciting, that is in alignment with what they really want. In fact, if we're doing a really great job of this, we're going above and beyond what they really want and going to their wildest imaginations of an ideal scenario of what would work really well for them. Now, we want to make sure that we're in integrity and alignment with results that can be genuinely expected. We want to make sure that we're able to share with them an augmented reality that has integrity, that can be the reality they end up seeing themselves in. Now, ultimately, what products or services do is they allow our customers to be more efficient or more effective in some way, shape, or form. They reduce the friction in what's currently going on. So one of the ways that we can serve our prospects or the people that we're working with is to invite them to see, can you see what it would be like if you were to have more time, if you were to implement this? What would that be like? That allows their imagination to open up, allows their window of opportunity to be even wider. So now that they're seeing themselves implementing the product or service real time in the present moment, but they're thinking about the future and how good their life is going to be as a consequence of saying yes to moving forward. Now, the last of the 12 A's is the A of addiction. This is what happens when we've done an excellent job communicating the previous 11 A's. See, what ends up happening is the prospect starts to look forward to connecting and communicating with us again because we've showed up so powerfully using the other A's. See, what happens when we're using the A's of influence is the people that we're communicating with are releasing dopamine and serotonin and the good neurotransmitters that get them excited to have the next interaction with us. A great example of this is one of our customers joined one of our training calls recently, and he mentioned that he had 6 people from the training call reach out to him personally to connect with him, to check in with him, to ask him questions. Because ultimately, he had used the A's of influence so powerfully that he created an addiction, he created a desire. Even though he didn't invite people necessarily to reach out to him, they wanted to, they felt compelled to. There was so much release of dopamine and serotonin, and there was a genuine desire to connect to that person. He had created a certain level of addiction where they wanted more of what he created in the conversation. At this point, once we have a baseline of mastery of the 11 A's, the addiction comes in when we can tell the prospect is essentially begging us for the next conversation. They're begging to buy something. People always want an excuse to buy. And in the business world, the relationships are built by the epic influencers who are able to create a baseline level of addiction, attraction to them, to their personality, to their way of being, to their capacity of communicating effectively, and then linking that addiction to the product or service that's going to get them the result that they're looking to get in the marketplace. The imagination A's of influence are the more advanced skill sets, yet they're the most powerful. When we can tell genuine stories that allow people to open up their imagination, to bring them into a world that they have never previously been in, we serve them at a level that they've never been served before. Those epic influencers who are willing to write down some certain key allegories that help the prospect imagine themselves in the shoes of the hero's journey of that allegory, become some of the most influential people on the planet. So as you begin to pay attention to some of the most powerful influencers out there, they use stories, metaphors, and they help those who they're working with imagine an alternate reality. They see it as it is and then help the people that we're working with see it better than it is. That's what a great leader does. They see the reality and then show others the path to a better reality. Now let's summarize what we've learned on the 12 A's of influence. Here's what we've learned. We've learned the simple principles of the 12 A's. That way you can guide any conversation linking the effortless combination of multiple A's. What might be a good practice for you is to take 2 of the A's at a time, consciously in your mind, and begin to implement them, to practice them. In fact, imagine what it would be like if you were at a Starbucks over the next couple days, or if you were out in the town or at the supermarket in a line anywhere, and the person in front of you, even though it didn't seem like they wanted to have a conversation, you simply pulled out a couple of the A's of influence, engaged them, connected with them, and brought them to an addiction level where they wanted to have a conversation with you again, where they were genuinely curious about you. What would it be like if for every week you chose 2 of the A's of influence and practiced them anywhere? Spaced repetition is what helps those who understand the A's of influence intellectually begin to embody it emotionally, so that we're not just consciously competent, where we have to think about applying an A of influence, but we're unconsciously competent, where the A's of influence just simply roll off the tongue, simply and easily, because we've done the work. We've practiced time in and time again. If you notice some of the best storytellers in the world, they're always practicing on how to make their stories better, how to bring just a little bit more tone to the conversation. You notice the best storytellers in the world, they're always practicing their stories. They're always practicing an improved version of how they can share the story in a way that the audience is receiving the information effortlessly. Remember, the intent is one thing, and it's really important how the information is received by the person we're communicating to. The more we practice the A's of influence, the more effortless it becomes for us to serve the people, lead the people that we're here on the planet to serve. So today we covered the connection A's, the leadership A's, the polarity A's, and the imagination A's. Tying these together, linking polarity A's to leadership A's, imagination A's to connection A's, will allow us to become the type of influencer that people want to be around, that people genuinely want to spend time with, that people are curious about what is that it factor that person has. That's when you know that you're on the path of being an epic influencer, when you're able to link all the A's together effortlessly and easily. In the meantime, it's going to take a little bit of effort. It's going to take some boots on the ground. It's going to take some execution, some implementation. And if you're already on the path to being an epic influencer, you know exactly how to do that. Your homework task, should you choose to accept it, and should you choose to remember that you are, in fact, an epic influencer, is to simply practice the A's of influence throughout the day. You don't need to be on a sales call. You don't need to be in a leadership conversation to practice the A's. We can be anywhere. You can be with a cab driver, a waiter, a neighbor, a stranger. Any opportunity, especially outside of a professional conversation, is a great opportunity to practice, to make mistakes, to learn, to get real-time feedback to when we're communicating with people, how is it received by them? If we want to test out a new story, test out a new language pattern, test out a new strategy for creating affinity with people, and we all know how to do this unconsciously, it's in the feedback that we get. So the more feedback that we get, the more we're able to improve our communication style and apply the A's of influence real time with our prospects, with the people we're serving, with the people we're leading. because we're willing to go above and beyond outside of the context of practicing influence with everyday people. So your homework assignment is to go out there and choose 2 of the A's of influence this week to communicate with a stranger or someone out there where you can get real-time feedback on how effective and efficient is your communication, how well is it received, and then we can just make these simple micro adjustments to improving the way that we share the information we're here to share as Epic Influencer. So go ahead and choose the 2 that you want to implement right now. Is it authenticity, appreciation, affinity, authentication, affiliation, authority, abundance, adherence, arousal, allegory, augmentation, addiction? Choose 2 right now that you want to apply and serve people, strangers, anybody, and practice the skills and mastery of becoming an epic influencer. I want to take a moment and appreciate you for making it through this segment of the program. Most people don't have the commitment to follow through and do the things that need to be done to make them stand ahead of the curve, to be the best of the best, to be the ones who rise above and do the simple things that help them serve and lead others. So thank you for being that type of person who's on the path of being an epic influencer.